series called He Shall Be Called. And it's a series based out of one verse in the Old Testament, out of Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6. And to refresh your thoughts a little bit on that, just a reminder that Isaiah was a prophet, which means he was able to say, "Thus saith the Lord," right? That he was given word and communication from God for the people. And in that communication, Isaiah tells both Jerusalem and Judah, both Israel and Judah, that they were in trouble. In fact, they weren't just in trouble. You could say that they were doomed. There is impending disaster hanging over them, and the disaster would take the form of the Assyrian Empire for the kingdom in the north and the Babylonians for the kingdom in the south. And Isaiah tells them that the Assyrians are going to ride in and they're going to destroy the 10 tribes of the north. And then shortly after that, the Babylonians are going to come in and destroy the tribes in the south. And it's terrible news. And it's news that, as terrible as it is, really didn't take anybody by surprise. They knew that they were guilty of turning their backs on things that were really important to God. And as far as that goes, what that would look like when you look through the history of Israel and the history of God's people was that they had turned their backs on the poor. They had turned their backs on the widows and the orphans. They had turned their backs on the marginalized and those who were on the fringe of society. And to make matters worse, they were worshiping idols as well and using religious service to extort people out of money and goods and all of these kinds of things. And God had just had it to the point where he said, that's enough. And Isaiah, I want you to give a message to the people that they're done. They're finished. But then in the midst of that message of gloom and despair, he says, I have another message that I want you to give them. And that message starts in chapter 7, but it culminates in chapter 9. And in chapter 9, he says that as desolate as things become, that God will rebirth the nation. But it won't be like the kingdom of old. It'll be different. Because this kingdom will be led by a different kind of king. And the different kind of king, you can see it in Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6. I'll throw that verse on the screen just so you can remember it. But he says, for to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government of this new kingdom will be on his shoulder. And he'll be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and Prince of Peace. And so even in the midst of despair, there's a sense of hope. There's a sense that God is up to something. And they're not exactly sure what, other than just what you're reading on the screen right there. And so in each message, we've kind of taken Wonderful Counselor, and we've talked about that, and we've talked about the Mighty God last week. And then this week, we're going to talk about the Everlasting Father and what that means. You know, all of us have what we might call father figures. And if we have not had a father figure, we at least know what a father figure is or what a father figure ought to be. And so you find a paradox immediately in this verse, right? That right there at the beginning, we're talking about a child, but then we skip down to the end of the verse, and now we're talking about an everlasting father. And we go, whoa, what is this all about, right? How does this make sense? And what I want you to understand is that in the world of Isaiah and in the world of the Levant and Palestine and Israel from hundreds of years before Jesus was born, they looked at kings as earthly kings to be father figures. Because you might imagine, and not all of us have had the best of fathers, but we know that at least a father is somebody in theory or by standard would be someone who practices the idea of protection and perseverance and provision and those kinds of things that we look at and we idealize to some extent. And so they took those things and they applied them to the kings. And they said, wow, a king is somebody who provides for us and cares for us in the way that a father might do. And then to couple that with the idea that this coming king was set on the throne of David, now all of a sudden we have a different idea about what this king was going to do. Because he's not only going to be a king who provides and cares for his people, but he's going to be a king who sits on the throne of David forever. Look at this verse in Isaiah chapter 22, and you'll see what I mean. In Isaiah chapter 22, just a few chapters down the road from Isaiah chapter 9, here is where Isaiah begins to talk about how all of this stuff in chapter 7, 8, 9 unfolds. And he says that God is going to promote a guy named Eliakim. And Eliakim was going to be the marker holder for the people of Israel, right? That he's going to preserve things, and he's going to be this type of leader for Israel and establish this path for this coming king. And look at what it says here. That he's going to clothe him with your robe. This is prophetic talk talking about Eliakim, but I want you to see that part of the highlighted verse. And he shall be a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and to the house of Judah. So he wasn't a literal father, so we don't need to read that into Isaiah chapter 9. We just need to understand that God is working about an eternal kingdom, an everlasting kingdom, and this king who resides over that is going to be a father figure to the people who live in that kingdom. How do we know? Look at chapter 9, verse 7. Look at what he says here. Of the increase of his government and peace, there will be no end. On the throne of David and over his kingdom to establish it and uphold it with justice and righteousness. From this time forth and forevermore, the zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. That's a long introduction to the idea of an everlasting Father and to a Christmas Eve message. But what I want you to understand in the midst of all of that is this, that when it looks like God is working for us, sometimes it looks like the enemy's winning. That when God is really on our side and God is working things out for our benefit, we don't always see it immediately. What Israel and Judah would have to look forward to over the next several hundred years after Isaiah drops this prophecy is a lot of hardship and a lot of difficulty and a lot of days when it was really hard to walk into the local synagogue or really hard to walk into the local temple and to pray and to realize that God is in control when it looks like your stock is going down, down, down and the enemy's getting stronger and stronger and stronger. It's tough. But that's the hope of prophecy, right? That's the hope of what Isaiah is saying, that even in the midst of when it looks like you're on the way out, God is up to something. And so I want us to unpack the Christmas story this morning from Luke chapter 2, and I want us to see it in light of what Isaiah says. Because once you begin to see the story in that way, you'll see some things that happen here that are pretty amazing. So let's just jump in. Luke chapter 2, verse 1. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus, that all the world should be registered. And this was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria, and all went to be registered, even to his own town. Now let me just say for a minute that Rome, who is in control at this time, lacks money. As all governments do, they want taxes and they want more taxes. And they want to make sure that if you are in the Roman Empire, you're paying your fair share, if not more. And so that's what this registration is for, is to make sure that everybody is paying their fair due, or at least more than that. And so they issue this idea that now there's a census that has to be taken, and so everybody has to go back to their place of origin. You can see in verse 4 what happened. So Joseph went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David. So immediately bells and whistles should go off for us, right? Because in Isaiah chapter 7, 8, 9, what was promised? A new king and a new kingdom. And the government of this new kingdom would be on his shoulders. And that kingdom and that king would look a whole lot like David's kingdom and David himself. And so what do we have here? The story about a child being born in and through the house and lineage of David. And so David gathers his new bride, and they make their way to Bethlehem to be registered with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. And while they were there, the time came for her to give birth. And she gave birth to her firstborn son, and she wrapped him in swaddling cloths and placed him in a manger. Her firstborn son. Very symbolic of the firstborn son out of the Exodus story. And she wraps him in rags would be a very polite way to say that. That she wraps this firstborn son in rags, places him in the manger because there's no room for them, no place for them in the inn. Now we can get the Hallmark greeting card out of our head and the kids' Christmas pageants when we have an innkeeper and Joseph and Mary knock on the door and they say, hey, is there a place here for us? No, all the rooms are taken. That's not the way this would have happened. That idea for the word inn is what we would call a guest bedroom or a prophet's chamber or something of that nature. David is going back to the place of his heritage. He was well known in the town. People knew David. They would have not disrespected him and his pregnant wife by keeping them outside somewhere. Joseph and Mary are very likely in the house of one of David or Joseph's relatives, and they're sleeping in the guest chamber. Or they're sleeping somewhere on the first floor with the animals. And so it's the best accommodation that they could have, but it's the accommodation that they needed. And so that's the story up until we bounce into verse 8, and look what happens next. And before we do that, though, I want to say one quick thing. And here's the thought. That the forces against God's people were actually moving things in their favor. Now, can you imagine for just a minute how Joseph and Mary thought that here Mary is pregnant, and she gets news that now she's going to have to jump on the back of a camel and make a journey of several weeks all the way to the house of Joseph's ancestors just so they can pay more taxes. I've not been pregnant before, but I can't imagine that's very good news to anybody, not to mention someone who's pregnant. And so here they are. They're going to have to make this journey. But what, again, is working behind the scenes and what Isaiah would want us to see is that even though it looks like things are moving in the wrong direction, God is actually bringing things into place exactly as they ought to be. And I just wonder if the same could be said of your life and mine. You know, the Christmas story finds us all in different places. The Christmas story for some of us comes with wonderful memories and nostalgia and warmness and love and care and presents and food and all of the things that we associate with Christmas. But not everybody has those memories. Not everybody has those experiences. Could it be that God is working something through those difficulties and those experiences where things are actually moving in your favor even though it might seem otherwise? It's very possible. In fact, I would say it's very likely that God is behind the scenes working something out. And sometimes the missing component between you getting that and understanding it is just the simple word, trust. Are we willing to trust God in the midst of our difficult circumstances? Are we willing to trust God when it looks like all hope is lost? Are we willing to trust God in the midst of burdens and difficulties? So Joseph and Mary are moving to Bethlehem. More taxes, traveling with a pregnant wife. difficulty to find lodging, but yet God is working it out. But they're not the only characters in the story, right? Because verse 8 starts and it says, "And in that same region there were shepherds out in the field keeping watch over their flock by night." You know, I have thought for years and years, why would God appear to the shepherds first? Why would God make this announcement to the shepherds before anyone else? Shepherds were not even allowed to give legal testimony in court. They were very untrusted or distrusted. I don't know, one of those two. They were not trusted. But yet, God is often referred to in Psalm 23 as a shepherd. Jesus is referred to as the shepherd. And you begin to wonder, well, why is that? Shepherds were not even allowed to worship in places of Jewish gathering because they were dirty and nasty, and they were just not the most reputable characters. And I can't help but wonder that maybe it's because the birth of this kid, the birth of this child, was going to establish the throne of David forever. And what was David before he was the king? Just a shepherd. Out in the field, watching the flock by night. The son of David is about to be born. How fitting that the announcement would come to shepherds and not the religious elite. And here's the announcement that the angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone round them, and they were filled with great fear. And the angel said to them, "Fear not, for behold, I bring you great news of joy that will be for all people. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, who is Christ the Lord." Exactly as Isaiah had promised, exactly as Isaiah said that it would be. "This will be a sign for you, that you'll find the baby wrapped in rags, lying in a manger." And suddenly there was with the angel a multitude of the heavenly host praising God, saying, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace among those with whom he is pleased." This is the message. This is the message of hope. This is the message that they had heard for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, that God was going to do something, but it sure looked like God had forgotten about them. And because that's what it looked like, that's why most of the Psalms are as aggressive as they are. God, have you forgotten about the promises that you made? Are you ashamed of yourself? God, is this why you're hiding your face? Because you made these big promises, and we've been relying on these promises, God, but you haven't come through at all. When you read the Psalms that way, you'll begin to read the way they were intended to be heard. Of people struggling with big promises and their own circumstances, and wondering how God would make do. Wondering how God would reconcile both of those things. And the shepherds hear that, and they understand that God is reconciling these things, their circumstances and the promises of God, somehow through this child who is born. Somehow that this child was going to grow up and become the things that Isaiah said: the wonderful counselor, the mighty God, the everlasting Father, and the Prince of Peace. And when the angels went away from them into heaven, the shepherds said one to another, "Let's go over to Bethlehem and see this thing that has happened, which the Lord has made known to us." And they went with haste and found Mary and Joseph and the baby lying in a manger. And when they saw it, they made known the saying that had been told them concerning this child. And all who heard it wondered at what the shepherds told them. I want you to see what Mary says next, Mary's reaction. Mary treasured all these things, pondering them in her heart. The word ponder is interesting there, because the word ponder carries with it the idea of churning something over again and again and again. And maybe you've gotten news like that, right? Maybe you've heard something like that before in the past. And it's just something that was on replay in your mind. And it was just something that went through again and again. And you're thinking about possible scenarios and outcomes. Well, if this happens, what about this? And if this happens, what about this? And what does this mean over here? And how do all these pieces fit together? And you're awake night after night, and you're just consumed by the thought of something. It's just one simple idea, but yet that's what the scriptures are telling us about Mary, that she is consumed with this thought about what God is going to do through her child. And so she ponders them in her heart, chewing them over again and again. And the shepherds return, glorifying and praising God for all they had seen and heard as it had been told them. You know, I asked you the first question of maybe God is working something out in your life. And you're just going to have to trust when it looks like the world is awfully dark. But I want you to see something else this Christmas story. I want you to ponder the story anew, just like Mary did. I want you to ponder the mystery again and again. And I want you to think deeply about the promises of God. Because the promises of God are not just about us aligning our thoughts with a few theological ideas, and now that we believe the certain few things that we need to believe, that when we die we get to go to heaven and sit on a cloud, and, you know, boy, that's great, right? Listen, that may be what you have heard, and it may be what you believe about the story, but that's not the story. The story is about God healing his broken and sick and hurt world. And he does that by offering his son. By bringing his son into the world so that his son would grow up, so that his son would teach and live the kind of life that we ought to live. And so that his son would show us a better way to be humans. A better way to be God's people. That we could learn from him. And that we could grow, and that eventually those teachings that we see in Jesus are not just teachings, that he would offer himself, as Ernie said, as the sacrifice for the sin of the world. So that God could birth in this world a new kingdom that was not like the kingdom of Assyria or Babylon or Persia or Rome or Greece or any of those other big empires. That it was a kingdom that would be of his son. A kingdom where the hungry find food. A kingdom where those who have been deprived of justice find justice. A kingdom where the thirsty find drink. And those who are in prison are liberated and set free. A kingdom where God's good world is groaning to be redeemed, and we get to be a part of that story. That's Christmas. That's the story that Jesus is telling, that Luke is telling us. And so I want you this morning just to ponder the mystery as it's fully revealed in the cross. And so we're going to do something this morning. We're going to have 4 people up front, and they're going to have candles in their hands. And you were given a candle when you came in. And I want to encourage you this morning to come and to light your candle from one of the candles of these 4 ladies. And as as you reflect on that light, I want you to imagine the light of God, the light of the gospel, the light of the world shining anew in your heart once again. And so just as we move toward finishing, here's the way things are going to look. You'll just file out, light your candle, return to your pew, and remain standing. And after everyone has lit their candles, I'll come back up and we'll finish by singing a song and worship together. Let's pray. God, thank you for being so